Disregard the corporate mythology of the Victoria's Secret empire. The story of the Wexner clan is, in reality, a clinical case study of a man's psychological collapse, a patriarch who offered up his own wife and children as collateral for his fragile ego. Leslie Wexner possesses billions, yet internally he is a hollow vessel. Raised under the thumb of a domineering mother, he developed a pathological need for guidance. This was his fatal flaw. Jeffrey Epstein did not use force to infiltrate this family. Les Wexner knelt. He voluntarily surrendered the keys to his life, believing he had found a brother to fill the void of his own insecurity. The true tragedy began in 1991, the moment Lee signed the power of attorney, granting a sexual predator absolute dominion over his fortune and his security. Abigail Wexner did not enter this marriage as a matriarch, but as a human shield. She and her 4 children were forced to exist in occupied territory, a home where the most dangerous predator in America roamed the hallways and sat at the dinner table with their children. The Wexner family was not defrauded. They were consumed from the inside out. The cost of this betrayal was not financial. It is the permanent, irreversible stain on a bloodline that must now live with a brutal truth. Their father chose to protect a monster rather than his own kin. A lonely billionaire and the predator. The seeds of the catastrophe that would eventually consume the Wexner children were sown decades before their birth, rooted in the suffocating psychological geometry of a Russian Jewish immigrant household in Dayton, Ohio. The family dynamic was defined by a devastating imbalance of power that permanently skewed Les Wexner's understanding of masculinity and authority. Harry Wexner, his father, was a man rendered almost invisible within his own home. Biographers describe Harry as a gentle but defeated figure, a shadow who moved quietly through the rooms, utterly eclipsed by the force of nature that was his wife. He offered his son no template for strength, no shield against the intensity of the matriarch. Harry was a ghost, leaving a vacuum of paternal power that Les would spend the rest of his life trying to fill. Bella Wexner filled that vacuum with the force of a tidal wave. She was not merely a mother, she was the architect of her son's entire existence. A woman of terrifying intellect and unyielding will, Bella managed the finances of the family's original clothing store and managed the psyche of her son with equal rigor. She viewed Les not as a separate individual with his own agency, but as an extension of her own ambition, a vessel she crafted to achieve the status she craved. The psychological umbilical cord between them was never cut. It was merely plated in gold as the family fortune grew. She was his first employer, his fiercest critic, and the sole arbiter of his self-worth. In the forensic history of the dynasty, Bella stands as the gatekeeper who molded Les into a commercial genius, while simultaneously stripping him of the emotional autonomy required to be a complete man. She instilled in him a crippling perfectionism and a deep-seated insecurity, the gnawing belief that he was nothing without her guidance. For the first 5 decades of his life, Les Wexner lived in a state of suspended adolescence. While his peers were marrying, raising families, and forging independent identities, Lee remained the dutiful son tethered to Bella's orbit. He lived a life of gilded isolation, a boy king who could command an empire of thousands, but could not navigate the simplest emotional landscape without a chaperone. Even after he became a billionaire, creating brands that defined the sexual zeitgeist of America, he did not build a life of his own. He built a monument to his loneliness. He constructed a massive estate in Ohio, but for decades, it was an empty stage set. There was no wife to share the master bedroom, no children to run through the halls. There was only Les surrounded by servants and the looming internalized voice of his mother. This prolonged bachelorhood was a symptom of a profound inability to connect. Les Wexner was the prince in the tower, visible to everyone, but touchable by no one. He was socially awkward, intensely shy, and plagued by the feeling that he was an imposter in his own life. He cultivated an image of sophistication, collecting modern art and listening to classical music, yet he remained an outsider, a man looking through the glass at the world of human intimacy. He possessed the money to buy anything, yet he lacked the cool, the swagger, the dangerous masculinity that he saw in the movies and in the magazines he sold. He was a man made of anxiety and sweaters, a billionaire who felt like a fraud, desperately waiting for someone to unlock the door to the real life he felt he was missing. By the mid-1980s, Les Wexner was a man in deep crisis. He was approaching 50, incredibly wealthy, and utterly alone. The death of his father, Harry, severed one link to the past, but it only intensified the focus of his mother. The psychological profile of Les Wexner at this moment is what forensic psychologists classify as an empty vessel. He was a man with a vast capacity for devotion, but no object to receive it. He was searching for a figure who could perform a specific, complex psychological function, to replace the overbearing mother with an overbearing brother. He did not need a business partner. He had conquered retail. He needed a mentor in living. He craved someone who could navigate the social hierarchies of New York and Palm Beach with the aggression and ease he lacked. He wanted an alter ego, a version of himself that was unburdened by fear, unconcerned with rules, and sexually liberated. He was tired of being the good boy from Ohio. He wanted to touch the flame. This desperate, unarticulated need created a blind spot the size of his entire fortune. Les Wexner was not looking for a financial advisor. He was looking for a savior who could validate his manhood. He was a lock waiting for a key. And in the chaotic, predatory ecosystem of 1980s high society, there was one man who specialized in unlocking billionaires, Jeffrey Epstein. The tragedy of the Wexner bloodline is that this psychological crisis occurred before the biological bloodline had even been established. Because Les had no wife or children in the 1980s, there was no immune system to protect him. In a healthy family dynasty, a spouse or adult children act as a defensive ring, spotting a grifter like Epstein and expelling him. They ask the hard questions. Who is this man? Where does his money come from? Why is he always whispering in father's ear? But Les had no such protectors. He had only sycophants who were on his payroll and a mother who was aging. He was exposed. The fortress of his wealth had thick walls to keep out thieves, but it had no defenses against a friend. The house was empty, the lights were on, and the door was unlocked. The stage was perfectly set for an invasion that would not steal the paintings off the walls, but would steal the soul of the man who bought them. The exact circumstances of the first meeting between Leslie Wexner and Jeffrey Epstein remain shrouded in a fog of conflicting dates and erased calendars, a testament to the secretive nature of the bond that formed between them. Most accounts place the encounter in the mid-1980s, likely at a social gathering in Palm Beach or New York. On paper, the pairing was an impossibility. Wexner was a retail emperor, a man whose net worth rivaled the GDP of small nations. Epstein was a college dropout from Brooklyn, a former math teacher turned financial drifter with a padded resume and no verifiable fortune. In the brutal calculus of high society, Epstein should have been invisible to Wexner. He was a nobody. But Epstein possessed a weapon that was far more potent than a balance sheet. He was a chameleon of terrifying precision. Epstein did not approach Wexner as a subordinate seeking a job. He approached him as an equal, perhaps even a superior. He recognized instantly that Wexner suffered from the imposter syndrome, common to self-made men who rise from humble beginnings to stratospheric wealth. Wexner felt uncomfortable in his own skin, perpetually worried that he was too provincial, too Ohio, too soft. Epstein presented himself as the antidote. He was everything Les was not: brash, physically imposing, aggressive behavior, and cloaked in an aura of international mystery. He spoke in rapid-fire bursts about currency markets and tax loopholes, weaving a tapestry of intelligence that dazzled the older man. Epstein didn't just walk into a room, he owned it. For Wexner, watching Epstein operate was like watching a movie star play the role of a billionaire. It was captivating. Forensic psychologists described the technique Epstein employed as mirroring. He studied his target with the intensity of a predator, identifying the deep, unmet needs in Wexner's psyche, and then molded his own personality to fill those voids. Lee craved intellectual validation. Epstein positioned himself as a rogue genius, a financial brain surgeon who saw patterns no one else could see. Les felt socially awkward. Epstein became his social battering ram, the man who could charm the women and intimidate the waiters. Les felt trapped by the morality of his upbringing. Epstein was the libertine who lived without rules. This dynamic created a bond that was far more intimate and dangerous than a business partnership. It was a symbiotic fusion. Epstein became Les Wexner's dark twin, the personification of the billionaire's repressed ID. Associates from that era recall that the two men became inseparable. They traveled together, dined together, and shopped for real estate together. Wexner, who had always been guarded and insular, suddenly opened up completely to this stranger. He looked at Epstein and saw the man he wished he could be. It was a seduction in the purest sense of the word, not necessarily sexual, but profoundly emotional. Epstein offered Les a second adolescence, a chance to be one of the cool kids for the first time in his life. As the psychological dependency deepened, Epstein moved to surgically remove the immune system that surrounded the billionaire. A wealthy man like Wexner is typically encircled by a phalanx of lawyers, accountants, and longtime advisors whose job is to protect the principal from fraud. These people were the natural enemies of a parasite. Epstein systematically dismantled them. He whispered in Les's ear that his old team was incompetent, that they were small thinkers who didn't understand the complex global game that Epstein was playing. He played on Les's insecurities, convincing him that his loyal lieutenants were actually holding him back. One by one, the voices of reason were silenced or fired. The accountants who asked to see Epstein's trading records were dismissed. The lawyers who questioned Epstein's background were shut out of meetings. Epstein created a closed loop of information where he was the only source of truth. He isolated the host. By the late 1980s, Les Wexner was effectively alone in a room with Jeffrey Epstein. The protective layer of skepticism that usually surrounds a fortune of that magnitude had been stripped away, peeling back the armor to reveal the soft, vulnerable human beneath. The predator had not just entered the house, he had locked the doors from the inside and convinced the owner that the people knocking outside were the enemies. The final element of this psychological capture was the shared lifestyle of the eternal bachelor. Before Abigail entered the picture, Les and Jeffrey existed in a world of masculine exclusivity. Epstein curated a lifestyle for Les that was exciting, dangerous, and transgressively freeing. They were partners in a private club of two. This period cemented Epstein's role not just as an advisor, but as a gatekeeper to pleasure and freedom. He made Les feel alive. This gratitude is what blinded Wexner to the red flags that were visible to everyone else. When rumors of Epstein's behavior with young women began to circulate, Lees didn't see a predator. He saw his friend, his brother, the man who had liberated him from his mother's shadow. He interpreted Epstein's deviance as eccentricity, a quirk of genius. This willful blindness was the price of admission for the friendship Les so desperately craved. He had found his alter ego, and he was willing to pay any price, including his own soul, to keep him. By the late 1980s, the infection of the Wexner household metastasized from a psychological influence into a structural takeover. Epstein realized that to secure absolute control, he could not simply whisper in Les's ear. He had to dismantle the corporate firewall surrounding the billionaire. He needed to eliminate the skeptics who asked for receipts and demanded logic. The most brutal casualty of this purge was Robert Murawski, the vice chairman of the limited and the operational genius who had built the logistical backbone of Wexner's empire. Murawski was everything Epstein was not: disciplined, transparent, and grounded in the reality of hard work. He was the adult in the room. When rumors began to circulate about Epstein's shadowy background and his bizarre influence over Les, Murawski and other senior executives raised flags. They questioned why a man with no credentials was sitting in on high-level strategy meetings. They questioned the logic of the financial schemes Epstein was proposing. Epstein's reaction was swift and lethal. He did not confront Murawski directly. Instead, he worked on Les's insecurities in the quiet of their private dinners. He painted Murawski and the old guard as plotters, as relics of the past, who lacked the vision to understand the future. He convinced Les that his oldest friends were actually jealous of his genius, that they were holding him back from true greatness. In 1987, under Epstein's influence, Robert Murawski, the man who had helped build the fortune, was forced out. It was a shocking decapitation of the corporate leadership. Les Wexner had chosen the mesmerizing stranger over the loyal brother in arms. This betrayal sent a chilling message to everyone else in Wexner's orbit. Question Jeffrey Epstein, and you will die professionally. With the skeptics removed, Epstein moved to fill the vacuum with a new kind of loyalty to him, not to the business. He began to involve himself in the hiring of household staff, security personnel, and even nannies. He effectively constructed a new Praetorian Guard around Les, composed of people who understood that their access to the billionaire was conditional on Epstein's approval. This was a classic cult tactic: isolation through dependency. By controlling who got to see Les, who got to speak to Les, and who got paid by Les, Epstein became the sole filter of reality. By 1990, the transformation was complete. The bustling, chaotic, but honest circle of advisors that had surrounded Les Wexner for decades had been replaced by a silence. The only voice that echoed in the hallways of the New Albany mansion was Jeffrey's. Les was now hermetically sealed inside a bubble of Epstein's creation. He had alienated his business partners, distanced himself from his extended family, and cut ties with the Jewish community leaders who had once been his peers. He was a king with only one subject. This total isolation was the prerequisite for the final act of the tragedy, the signing of the document that would legally hand over the keys to the kingdom. There was no one left in the room to grab Les's hand and say, "Stop." The psychological annexation of Les Wexner culminated in a specific, terrifying legal event that remains unparalleled in the history of American wealth. On July 26, 1991, inside a quiet office likely devoid of the usual legal guardians who would have screamed in protest, Les Wexner signed a document that acted as his own spiritual execution. It was a general power of attorney. In the world of high net worth individuals, Limited powers of attorney are common for specific transactions, but this document was an aberration. It granted Jeffrey Epstein, a man with no degree, no license, and a shadowed past, absolute unrestricted dominion over Les Wexner's entire existence. This piece of paper gave Epstein the legal authority to do anything Les could do: sign checks, buy and sell real estate, hire and fire staff, borrow money, and bind Wexner to contracts. It was not a delegation of duties. It was an abdication of self. By inking his signature, Les Wexner effectively erased his own agency and appointed Epstein as his proxy in the physical world. It was a legal fusion of identities. The patriarch had voluntarily handed the keys to the kingdom, the fortune built by his mother's grit and his own 50 years of labor, to a predator who viewed the family merely as a host to be drained. The most visceral symbol of this surrender was the transfer of the Herbert N. Strauss house. This 21,000 square foot limestone mansion at 9 East 71st Street in Manhattan was the crown jewel of Wexner's real estate portfolio, a property of immense historical significance and value. Les had spent years and millions of dollars renovating it, intending it to be his legacy home, the place where he would perhaps raise a family, yet he never moved in. Instead, in a transaction that baffled real estate experts and terrified his remaining friends, the rights to the mansion were transferred to entities controlled by Epstein. While money technically changed hands on paper, the forensic reality was that Les effectively gave the house to Epstein. The predator moved in, taking over the master bedroom that was meant for Les. He filled the house with his art, his surveillance cameras, and his network of young victims. The house that was supposed to be the Wexner family's ancestral seat in New York became the headquarters of an international human trafficking ring. This was not just a loss of property. It was a profound violation of the family's domestic sanctity. Les had built the nest and the cuckoo had taken it. The signing of the power of attorney in 1991 marks the moment of Les Wexner's spiritual death. From that day forward, he was a passenger in his own life. Epstein used his new power to infiltrate every corner of the Wexner world. He set up the trusts. He managed the philanthropic foundations. He became the gatekeeper to Les's private life. This usurpation meant that the Wexner bloodline was compromised before it even technically existed. When Les would later marry and have children, they would be born into a system already rigged by a monster. Their inheritance was managed by him, their security was hired by him, their father was owned by him. The Soul Contract of 1991 ensured that the Wexner family would never truly be alone. The shadow of Jeffrey Epstein was already cast over the nursery of the children who were yet to be born, a dark inheritance waiting to claim its price in trauma and shame. The patriarch had sold the safety of his future kin for the friendship of a ghoul, a marriage of three, Les Abigail and Jeffrey Epstein. By late 1991, Leslie Wexner was approaching a demographic cliff that threatened the very legitimacy of the dynasty he was trying to build. He was 54 years old, the wealthiest man in Ohio, and the creator of a brand, Victoria's Secret, that was redefining female sexuality for the masses. Yet his own private life was a vacuum of intimacy that had begun to draw whispers. For decades, he had lived as a confirmed bachelor, deeply enmeshed in a codependent relationship with his mother Bella, and more recently, in an intense, all-consuming bond with Jeffrey Epstein. The optics were becoming a liability. In the conservative social circles of the Midwest, a billionaire without a wife or heir is viewed with suspicion. Rumors regarding Wexner's sexuality and the true nature of his relationship with the mysterious financial advisor from New York were beginning to circulate, threatening to crack the carefully polished veneer of the merchant prince. Forensic biographers argue that the decision to marry was not driven by a sudden lightning strike of romance, but by a cold dynastic necessity. Wexner was in the process of building his magnum opus, New Albany, a sprawling utopian community in Ohio designed to look like a Georgian English village. He was building a fiefdom, and a fiefdom requires a queen and heirs. The bachelor king needed a wife to complete the set. But unlike a normal courtship, where two people find each other in the chaos of life, this search was conducted under the watchful, predatory eye of the man who held the keys to Les's soul, Jeffrey Epstein. The tragedy of the future Mrs. Wexner began here, before she even met her husband. She was not walking into a romance. She was walking into a recruitment process for a role that had been defined, vetted, and approved by a sex trafficker. The introduction of Abigail Koppel to the inner circle was a masterclass in triangulation. Abigail was 30 years old, a highly intelligent corporate lawyer practicing in London and New York. She was polished, attractive, and possessed the sharp legal mind that Les admired. But to enter Les's life, she first had to pass through the Epstein filter. Sources close to the trio during this period describe a disturbing dynamic where Epstein acted almost as a protective older brother or a jealous gatekeeper. He was the one who managed Les's schedule. He was the one who advised Les on character judgments. It is a psychological horror unique to this family. The predator helps select the prey. Epstein likely viewed Abigail not as a threat to his dominance, but as a necessary prop, a beard of sorts, or a legitimizing figure who would distract the public from the bizarre intensity of the Le Jeffrey bond. He needed someone who could play the part of the society wife perfectly, someone who would busy herself with philanthropy and horses, leaving the darker financial and personal machinations to the men. Abigail passed the test. She was deemed safe. She was allowed to enter the bubble. But she was entering a relationship where the emotional intimacy was already hoarded by another man. She was the third wheel in her own courtship. The wedding ceremony took place at Wexner's estate in New Albany, amidst a winter snowstorm. It was the social event of the decade in Ohio, a coronation of the new power couple. Yet the invisible architecture of the event was defined by the presence of the alter ego. While Les stood at the altar waiting for his bride, his mind and his fortune were legally tethered to Jeffrey Epstein. Just months prior, Les had effectively signed away his financial soul to another master. This context transforms the wedding from a celebration into a tragedy of dramatic irony. Abigail Koppel walked down the aisle to pledge her life to a man who had already pledged his life to someone else. She was marrying a man who, in the eyes of the law, did not fully own his own signature. Epstein was not merely a guest at the wedding. He was the silent partner in the union. He was the specter at the feast, the man who knew where the bodies were buried, the man who had facilitated the transfer of wealth that paid for the flowers and the champagne. As Abigail said, "I do," she locked herself into a throuple defined by coercion and secrets. She became the public face of a private hell. The most perplexing aspect of this union is Abigail's own agency. She was not a naive debutante. She was a trained lawyer. How did she miss the red flags? The answer lies in the sophistication of the manipulation. Epstein and Les presented a united front of genius. Epstein was framed not as a grifter, but as a financial savant, an eccentric wizard who relieved Les of the burden of money management. Abigail was likely seduced by the sheer scale of the life Les offered, the private jets, the estates, the limitless philanthropic budget. However, almost immediately she found herself in a golden cage. The domestic sphere she was supposed to rule was porous. Epstein had the run of the house. He had the ear of the husband. He influenced the staffing. Abigail found herself in a marriage where she had to compete for her husband's attention, not with another woman, but with a man who held a psychological grip on Les that she could not break. She became the manager of the facade. Her job was to normalize Les, to soften his edges, to present a picture of domestic bliss to the world, while behind the scenes the predator continued to siphon off the family wealth and use the family name to cloak his crimes. She had traded her legal career for a life where the law did not apply, trapped in a mansion where the locks were controlled by a monster. Between 1993 and the late 1990s, the Wexner household underwent a profound transformation. Abigail gave birth to 4 children: Harry, Hannah, David, and Sarah. To the outside world, the arrival of these heirs completed the portrait of the American dream. Les Wexner, the merchant prince, finally had his dynasty. The New Albany estate, once a sterile monument to a bachelor's ego, was filled with the sounds of crying babies, ponies, and the chaotic joy of childhood. But in the forensic reality of the family finances, these children were born into occupied territory. From the moment they drew their first breath, the Wexner children were entangled in a legal and financial web spun by Jeffrey Epstein. Because of the 1991 power of attorney and Epstein's role as the primary trustee of the Wexner family trust, the predator technically held the purse strings to their future. He was not just a friend of the father. He was the custodian of the children's inheritance. This created a grotesque power dynamic where the man, who would later be convicted of serious offenses against minors, held a fiduciary duty over the welfare of Les Wexner's own offspring. The wolf was not huffing at the door. He was holding the deed to the house. The proximity of Jeffrey Epstein to the Wexner children was not metaphorical. It was physical and terrifyingly intimate. On the sprawling grounds of the Wexner estate in New Albany, a compound designed to be the safest place in Ohio, Epstein was given his own residence. He frequently stayed in the guest house, located just a stone's throw from the main mansion where the children slept. He was a fixture in their lives, a man who came and went without security checks, a man who had the run of the grounds. Former staff members and associates have described Epstein's presence during these years as ubiquitous. He was treated as a member of the family, a weird uncle figure who sat at the dinner table, offered unsolicited advice on parenting, and critiqued the children's development. For Abigail Wexner, this must have been a daily quiet nightmare or a feat of catastrophic denial. She was raising her children in a gated community of one, where the gate was locked to keep the world out, but the most dangerous man in America was locked inside with them. The psychological toll of normalizing a predator's presence in a domestic setting cannot be overstated. The children were raised to view Epstein not as a threat, but as an authority figure, a man to be respected and obeyed because their father deferred to him. This normalization is a form of grooming by proxy, desensitizing the family to the darkness sitting on their sofa. The tragedy of the Wexner bloodline in this era was the abdication of Les Wexner's most primal duty, the protection of his young. A father's role is to stand between his children and the dangers of the world. Les did the opposite. He invited the danger in. By granting Epstein influence over the household staff, Epstein reportedly played a role in vetting security personnel and nannies. Les effectively outsourced the safety of his children to a sociopath. There are chilling accounts of Epstein using his proximity to the Wexner family to burnish his own credentials, using the wholesome image of the Wexner kids to mask his own predatory lifestyle. He could point to his relationship with the children as proof of his normalcy. How could I be a monster? I'm the godfather to the billionaire's kids. The Wexner children became unwilling human shields for Epstein's reputation. Their innocence was weaponized to provide cover for his crimes. Les Wexner, in his obsession with his alter ego, sacrificed the sanctity of his children's privacy. He allowed the predator to access the one thing that money cannot replace: the safe, unpolluted memories of a childhood. The Wexner children grew up in a house where the air was poisoned by secrets, unaware that the man eating breakfast with them was simultaneously running a global human trafficking ring using their father's money. The most disturbing aspect of Abigail Wexner's role in this triangular tragedy was not her passivity, but her active participation in legitimizing the predator. As a lawyer and a socialite, Abigail's primary function within the dynasty was to be the face of its benevolence. She chaired the boards, cut the ribbons, and managed the massive charitable giving that solidified the Wexner's status as American royalty. Yet forensic accounting reveals that Jeffrey Epstein used Abigail's philanthropy as a washing machine for his own reputation. Epstein frequently donated to the charities Abigail championed, and in return he was granted access to the polite society that would otherwise have shunned him. By accepting his money and allowing him to attend her galas, Abigail effectively vouched for him. She signaled to the mothers and fathers of Ohio that Uncle Jeff was safe. This complicity creates a terrifying moral stain on the family legacy. The Wexner matriarch, knowingly or not, acted as a character witness for a man who was hunting the daughters of the very demographic she claimed to serve. She traded the moral integrity of her platform for the financial liquidity he provided. Observers often ask why Abigail Wexner, a trained attorney, did not simply demand that her husband sever ties with the creep in the guest house. The answer lies in the terrifying legal architecture of the Wexner fortune. Because of the power of attorney signed in 1991 and the complex trust structures Epstein created, the family's wealth was effectively held hostage. Epstein had constructed a financial maze so dense that untangling it would require years of litigation and could potentially expose the family to financial ruin or public scandal. Abigail was wearing golden handcuffs of the heaviest caliber. Her lifestyle, the horses, the estates, the private jets, the security for her children, was funded by a spigot that Epstein controlled. To challenge him was to challenge the flow of money. To divorce Les would have been to divorce a man whose assets were legally intertwined with a sociopath. She was a prisoner of the luxury she inhabited. The tragedy of Abigail Wexner is the tragedy of the deal with the devil. She accepted the premise that Epstein was the wizard who made the billions grow, and the price of that growth was her silence. She learned to look the other way, to rationalize the bizarre behavior, to ignore the rumors, because the alternative was to blow up the foundation of her entire life. By 2007, when Epstein was first arrested in Florida, the Wexner family attempted to sever ties. Lees wrote a letter claiming he had been deceived. Abigail scrubbed the photos, but the damage to the bloodline was permanent. For 14 formative years, the Wexner marriage had been a throuple. The children had been raised under the gaze of a monster. The wife had served as the hostess for a sex trafficker. The spiritual death of the family was complete. They retained their billions, but they had lost their name. They became a family defined not by the lingerie they sold, but by the silence they kept. Abigail Wexner remains the chatelaine of New Albany, but she walks through a house that history will forever remember as a crime scene of the soul, a place where a mother allowed a predator to sit at the head of the table because he paid the bills. When the secrets came out. On July 6, 2019, The private jet carrying Jeffrey Epstein touched down at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, where FBI agents were waiting to arrest him on federal human trafficking charges. For the world, this was the beginning of a sensational news cycle. For the Wexner family, sequestered in their fortress in New Albany, Ohio, it was the detonation of a dirty bomb inside their living room. Leslie Wexner was 81 years old, a man in the twilight of his life, battling the physical frailties of age and preparing for a dignified exit from the public stage. He believed that he had successfully buried the Epstein problem 12 years earlier, in 2008, when he severed ties following Epstein's first lenient conviction. He believed the firewall held. He was wrong. The 2019 indictment did not just target Epstein, it effectively indicted the source of his power. Within hours of the arrest, the global media narrative shifted from "Who is Jeffrey Epstein?" to "Who paid for Jeffrey Epstein?" The answer, inevitably and repeatedly, was Les Wexner. The psychological impact on the octogenarian patriarch was immediate and devastating. Associates described a man who went into a state of shock, a king in exile, watching his lifetime of carefully curated reputation management disintegrate in real time. The mortality curse had returned with a vengeance. The ghost he had invited into his home in the 1980s had risen from the grave to drag him down into it. In the weeks following the arrest, the pastoral utopia of New Albany, the English-style village Les had built as a sanctuary, was transformed into a besieged bunker. Journalists from around the world descended on the town, camping out at the gates of the Foxborough estate. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing footage of the mansion where the head of the snake, as some conspiracy theorists labeled Wexner, was hiding. Abigail Wexner found herself commanding a household under siege. The golden cage had become a literal prison. The family retreated indoors. The blackout curtains were drawn. The social calendar, once filled with galas and equestrian events, was wiped clean. The first family of Ohio became invisible. Inside the house, the atmosphere was necrotic. Les was reported to be in rapidly declining health, suffering from the psychosomatic toll of the scandal. He was a man watching his obituary being written while he was still alive, and the headline was not "Retail Genius," but Epstein's enabler. The walls he had built to keep the world out were now keeping the horror in. The family was trapped with the consequences of the patriarch's sin, isolated in a luxury that felt increasingly like a mausoleum. The sudden physical and mental disintegration of Les Wexner in 2020 was not merely a reaction to legal pressure, it was a structural failure of his own ego. For 30 years, Jeffrey Epstein had served a singular, vital function for the billionaire. He was the mirror. He was the daily reinforcement that Les was a genius, a visionary, a man operating on a plane of existence far above the laws of ordinary mortals. Epstein had validated Les's every insecurity, convincing him that their bond was one of intellectual equals, two titans looking down on the world. The revelations of 2019 did not just break the law, they broke the mirror. As the depth of Epstein's deception became undeniable, that the financial wizard was likely a Mossad-linked asset or simply a high-level grifter who viewed Lees as a whale to be harpooned, Les Wexner suffered a catastrophic narcissistic stroke. The humiliation was absolute. He was forced to confront the reality that his best friend, the man he had trusted with his soul and his fortune, had likely never loved him. He had been played. The alter ego he idolized was a phantom. This realization inflicted a specific kind of spiritual injury that is often fatal to the psyche of powerful men. Sources close to the family described a rapid, terrifying shift in Les's demeanor during this period. The sharp, micromanaging intellect that had built Victoria's Secret evaporated, replaced by a fog of confusion and withdrawal. He was not just hiding from the FBI, he was hiding from the shame of his own gullibility. He had traded his reputation for a friendship that was a lie. The mortality curse manifested here not as a heart attack, but as a total collapse of self-worth. He became a man haunting his own hallways, muttering about betrayal, a King Lear wandering the heath of New Albany while the storm raged outside. The tragedy of the bloodline was compounded by the forced severance of Les's primary emotional tether, his company. For Les Wexner, L. Brands, the parent of Victoria's Secret, was not merely a corporation, it was his firstborn child, the entity he had nurtured since 1963, long before his biological children were born. It was his identity. I am the brand, and the brand is me, was the unspoken mantra that had ruled his life. In early 2020, as the Epstein scandal metastasized, the immune system of Wall Street finally rejected him. The board of directors, once filled with loyalists who owed their careers to Les, turned on him. The stock price was tanking, not because of poor sales, but because the CEO's name was radioactive. The pressure was brutal and intimate. It was a corporate regicide. Lee was effectively told that to save the child, the company, the father had to die. Stepping down as CEO and chairman was a form of patricide. When he signed the papers to surrender control, he severed the last link to his relevance. He was no longer Les Wexner, the merchant prince. He was just a wealthy old man with a dirty secret. He returned to the New Albany estate not as a conqueror retiring to his palace, but as a deposed despot sent into exile. The psychological toll on Abigail and the children was palpable. They were now locked in the house with a man who had lost his purpose. They watched the patriarch shrivel. The dynamic shifted from reverence to pity and perhaps to a quiet, simmering resentment. He had stayed too long at the party, and now he was burning the house down on his way out. During this exile, whispers began to circulate in Ohio society and legal circles about Les Wexner's cognitive health. Reports emerged of neurocognitive issues, severe memory lapses, and a general frailty that seemed to accelerate by the week. To the cynics and the lawyers representing Epstein's victims, this was a convenient shield, a classic defense strategy to avoid testifying in the looming lawsuits. If he can't remember, he can't be deposed. However, to those observing the family dynamic from the inside, the decline appeared genuinely psychosomatic. The guilt and stress of the exposure were eating him alive. Abigail Wexner found herself transitioning from the role of a society hostess to that of a hospice nurse for a reputation. She had to manage the physical reality of a husband who was failing, shielding him from the harshest headlines while simultaneously trying to protect her adult children from the fallout. The New Albany mansion transformed into a mausoleum. The vibrant energy of the estate, the equestrian events, the fundraisers, the flow of guests, stopped dead. The family retreated into a bunker mentality. The children, Harry, Hannah, David, and Sarah, were trapped in a paradox. They possessed billions of dollars, yet they could not show their faces in the circles they were born into without seeing the shadow of Epstein behind every polite smile. They were the heirs to a kingdom that had become a crime scene. On the morning of August 10th, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. For the world, this was the end of a sordid chapter. For Les Wexner, it was the beginning of a life sentence without parole. Superficially, one might assume the death of the accuser would bring relief to the accused. In reality, Epstein's suicide was the worst possible outcome for the Wexner family. Had Epstein lived to face trial, there was a slim possibility of closure, a chance for facts to be litigated, for distinctions to be drawn, for Les to perhaps testify that he was a victim of financial fraud rather than a co-conspirator in sexual abuse. But with Epstein dead, the narrative froze in amber. The secrets died in that cell. Les Wexner was denied the opportunity for exoneration. He was left holding the bag for a dead man's crimes, eternally linked to a monster who could no longer speak. In the court of public opinion, the silence of the grave was interpreted as an admission of guilt. The ghost of Epstein became more powerful than the living man, hanging over New Albany like a permanent storm cloud that no PR strategy could disperse. Following the death, the social immune system of the elite began to attack the Wexner organism. The name Wexner, which for decades had been synonymous with generosity, medicine, and art, became a glyph of shame. At Ohio State University and Harvard, where Les and Abigail had donated millions, students and faculty demanded the removal of their name from buildings. The Wexner Center for the Arts, once a jewel of their legacy, became a site of protest. This erasure hit the family at its most vulnerable point, their pride. The Wexner children, raised to believe their surname was a ticket to respect, watched as it became a liability. They were witnessing the real-time demolition of their heritage. The mortality curse here was not physical death, but social death. The family retained their billions, but their social capital, the currency that truly matters to the ultra-wealthy, was demonetized. They were wealthy pariahs, forced to retreat further into the physical isolation of their estate, cut off from the community they had built. Today, Leslie Wexner exists as a specter in his own life. The merchant prince who reshaped the American mall is now a recluse, rarely seen outside the gates of his New Albany fortress. The tragedy of his final act is absolute. He is a man who spent 50 years building a monument to his own greatness, only to have it defaced by the one person he allowed inside the ropes. Abigail Wexner remains the warden of this luxurious prison, managing the silence, protecting the frail patriarch, and holding together a family that is inextricably bound by trauma. They are trapped in a haunted house of their own making. The guest house where Uncle Jeff stayed is empty, but his presence fills every room. The lesson of the Wexner dynasty is a brutal one. You can buy silence, you can buy security, and you can buy the law, but you cannot buy your way out of the shadow of the devil once you have invited him in for dinner. The legacy is sealed. History will not remember Les Wexner for the bras he sold, but for the soul he sold. 4 heirs left to clean up a tainted legacy. The true victims of the Wexner curse are not the parents who made the deals, but the 4 children, Harry, Hannah, David, and Sarah, who must now navigate the world carrying a surname that has been transmuted from gold into lead. In the aristocratic circles of New York, London, and Palm Beach, the name Wexner once opened every door. It signified retail royalty, vast philanthropy, and impeccable connections. Today, it signifies something else entirely. It acts as a conversation stopper, a trigger for awkward silences. To understand their burden, one must look at the silence inside the home. The most haunting image of the family's collapse is the dinner table in 2020. There sat Les, the broken king, physically present but spiritually absent, perhaps struggling to recall the details of the past, or perhaps willfully suppressing them. Across from him sat Abigail, the manager of the ruins, maintaining the facade of normalcy. And around them sat the 4 heirs, the children, who had called a sex trafficker Uncle Jeff, now fully aware of what that meant. The silence at that table was heavy with unasked questions. Dad, did you know? Mom, why did you let him stay in the guest house? But in the Wexner dynasty, as in the time of Bella, silence was the currency of survival. They did not confront the patriarch, they protected him. They circled the wagons, but the bond of trust was shattered. The children were no longer looking at a father, they were looking at a liability. The legacy had shifted from building an empire to surviving the shame. The curse was complete. The family was rich, safe, and together, yet they were utterly, irrevocably destroyed. This psychological burden was compounded by a public assault. If the 2019 arrest was a nuclear explosion, the July 2022 release of the Hulu documentary series Victoria's Secret, Angels and Demons, was the radioactive fallout that settled permanently over the Wexner estate. For 3 years, the family had retreated into silence, hoping the news cycle would move on. They were wrong. The documentary repackaged the family tragedy as a gothic horror story for the streaming generation. For the first time, millions of viewers were given a guided tour of the bizarre, intimate machinery of the Leigh-Jeffrey relationship. The series broadcast archival footage that was devastating in its banality. Les Wexner, looking at Epstein with eyes full of adoration. It mainstreamed the hypnosis theory, presenting the patriarch not as a villainous mastermind, but as a pathetic man colonized by a drifter. For the Wexner heirs, this was a violation of privacy more intrusive than any FBI raid. Their personal history was being binge-watched and dissected on TikTok by teenagers who knew their father not as a philanthropist, but as the guy who funded the island. The family's reaction to this renewed assault was a deafening strategic silence. This bunker mentality created a suffocating atmosphere within the New Albany estate. They became ghosts in their own community. The unspoken rule in the household was undoubtedly to never turn on the television, to never search the family name online. They were living in a suspended reality, pretending that the world outside was not burning their effigies. The cruelest irony of the heirs' existence is the financial shackle that binds them to the ghost. The billions of dollars that support their lifestyles, the equestrian careers, the travel, the investments, flow from trust structures largely architected by Jeffrey Epstein. They are trapped in a paradox. To reject Epstein is to reject the source of their own security. Every dollar they spend is, in a forensic sense, Epstein money. They cannot simply walk away from the legacy because the legacy is the air they breathe. They are the richest, loneliest orphans in Ohio, heirs to a kingdom that no one wants to rule. The final act of the Wexner tragedy played out not in a courtroom, but on the billboards of Times Square. In 2021, L Brands, now separated from Wexner, launched a desperate campaign to save Victoria's Secret. The Angels were fired. The fashion show was canceled. The company was screaming to the world, "We are no longer the plaything of a creepy old billionaire." For Les Wexner, watching from his exile, this was the ultimate humiliation. The empire he built was surviving only by erasing his DNA from its code. When forensic historians look back at the life of Leslie Wexner, they will not see a story of business triumph, but a modern retelling of the Faustian legend. Les Wexner wanted more than money. He wanted what he could not naturally possess. He wanted the swagger, the danger, and the virility that he projected onto Jeffrey Epstein. He made a deal. He traded his autonomy, his reputation, and the sanctity of his home for the feeling of being chosen by a man he considered a genius. The bill for that trade has now come due. The Wexner family retains their billions, but they have lost the only currency that matters to a dynasty, their moral authority. They built a utopia in New Albany, but they live in it like squatters in a haunted house. The mortality curse of this family is not that they died young, but that they lived too long. They lived long enough to see their name turn to ash. Today, the Foxborough estate stands as a monument to a catastrophic error in judgment. It is a golden cage where a frail old man waits for the end, guarded by a wife who looked the other way and children who must carry the weight of his sins. The legacy of Les Wexner is no longer the libraries he built or the trends he started. His legacy is the silence of the victims who were abused on his property and the silence of the family who let it happen. The empire has fallen. The king is dead. Long live the shame.